Welcome to Big Tent USA. We are a pro-democracy, women-led organization. Please follow us on social media at Big Tent USA or go check out our website. Our upcoming events include Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, which is tomorrow night at 7. And we have our first ever multi-speaker event, which is called our Democracy Won't Save Itself Forum. This is a pre-State of the Union event on March 1st at 7 o'clock. And it features our pro-democracy experts, Deval Patrick from Bridge Together, Joanna Ludgate from States United Democracy Center, Noah Bookbinder from CREW, the Center for Ethics and Responsibility in Washington, and Angela Corazon from Media Matters. This is an A-team pro-democracy group, and they will tell us what we need to know about the authoritarian threats that we face and what we can do in 2022 and beyond to save our democracy. At noon on April 5th, we have the founders of a new but mighty voter registration organization in Florida called Mi Vecino, who will join us for a tent talk. So we hope you'll join us for all of those, and there'll be more coming. We are kicking off this 2022 tent talk with a very special guest, Jackie Payne, who is the founder and executive director of Galvanize USA. And coming back to the tent to moderate this call is the one and only Catherine Briggs. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and I'm so sorry about that. I had hit my mute button. Please put your questions in the chat, and if you need the live transcript at the bottom, and Catherine, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for having us back. It's my true honor to introduce Jackie Payne. She has over 20 years of experience leading organizations and working to advance gender, racial, and economic justice. Before she quit her job in 2016 and founded Galvanize USA and Galvanize Action, Jackie designed and ran an $80 million movement building project for the Novo Foundation, where she worked to develop an intersectional approach to ending violence against girls and women. She previously championed reproductive justice as the Director of Government Relations for Planned Parenthood, and also advocated for economic justice as a legal aid lawyer and as a policy attorney for the Now Legal Defense and Education Fund. She's a Midwesterner. She graduated from University of Illinois, and she received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan, Go Blue. She is a trustee of the Patsy Takemoto Mink Foundation. Patsy was the first woman of color elected to Congress in 1965, and she's on the board of the Women and Justice Project. And in her spare time, you'll find Jackie coaching her 8-year-old son's 8-year-old soccer team. And it's my true honor to introduce to you, Jackie. Jackie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I hope everyone has a Catherine Briggs in her life. She has been a total blessing to Galvanize and is such a great friend to us and leader and ambassador. So thanks, Catherine. I'm going to share my screen. As I do, I want to say what an absolute delight it is to be the first speaker for y'all for 22. I know that I'm in good company. I know that you all are also recently galvanized to figure out how can you use yourself, your resources, your time to save democracy, which is very much the story of Galvanize. So I feel like I'm with my people today. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try to do this correctly. Let's see if we got it. Okay. Today, I am going to deal with the reality that we're living in, right? But I'm also going to offer you some hope and some good news about where we can go together. So I think the reality is we all just lived through the 1-year anniversary of violent insurrection. We've just had that in our recent past, and we're watching globally as democracy is being threatened. And so it's a pretty stressful and scary time. But there is some good news in terms of what we've been able to discover in the last couple of years about how to combine research, neuroscience, and behavioral psychology to actually connect with and move voters towards progress and towards democracy. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Oh, first, let me say that I have 2 organizations. The first is Galvanize USA. That is a nonpartisan civic empowerment program that really helps to build women's political knowledge, competence, and agency. And Galvanize Action, that's my short term. There's a race coming up. How do I move the margins? Think of that as the research and persuasion arm. So what I wanted to do is first deal with reality. Here we are. We've got we're in this place where the majority of Republicans don't believe that President Biden was legitimately elected, where a third of Trump voters believe that violence may be necessary to save democracy, and where 22% of Democrats are joining them. So we have a fifth of the electorate believing that violence may be necessary now to save our democracy. Those are the conditions within which we can have an insurrection in 2020, and which military experts fear will lead to an even greater insurrection between November 2024 and the early months of 2025. So that's the context that we're living within. And this is something that's happening in the US, but it's also definitely happening globally. What we're seeing is toxic polarization, the us versus them, being used to divide voters. And that is a traditional tool of fascism and authoritarianism, to use disinformation and misinformation that's grievance-based, try to rip voters apart. And in that division, there's enough chaos that you can end up moving away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. What the reality of the United States is that as we become more and more polarized, it's exposing a fundamental truth about our democracy. We all know, as students of history, that our forefathers created this country with an intentional structural bias in favor of less populous rural states, right? The Senate and the Electoral College are intentionally designed to privilege less populous rural states. What we're seeing now is that even as America diversifies, we're also becoming geographically concentrated. So in 2054-ish, we should have a majority people of color electorate. But what we're seeing is the majority of the United States population, it's concentrating along the coastline. I like to think of this as sort of the smile of America. So what you have is majority folks of color and more liberal folks living along the coastline. And then by 2040, so within 20 years, 70% of the US population will live in just 16 states, those marked in blue here, which means the other 30% of the population, which is disproportionately white and rural, will control 68 Senate seats, which means they control the Supreme Court, and with the Electoral College, quite possibly the White House. So in order for us to advance progress, we've got to, in the short term, hold on to the Senate, right? We've got to win the Senate, which includes some states here, battleground states from these yellow states. And then we've also got to be thinking about, in the long term, how do we build a durable multiracial majority that wants to defend this democracy and advance progress. So this is probably the most shocking chart that I have. And then I promise we're moving towards hope. And that is that, you know, when I first started out, I didn't realize just how disproportionately powerful white women voters are. There are, you can see from this chart, there are more white women voters than all voters of color combined. And so white women actually have a significant amount of power in determining the future of our country, both because of the scale of how many white women voters there are, but also if you think back to that last map about where folks live, right? So we have got to think about both the fact that we've got the white women the largest share of voters, and that in the battleground states, they're also the most persuadable voters we have. So in our movement towards progress and intended to save democracy, our allies are working on addressing voter suppression, persuading and turning out voters of color where that matters most. What Galvanize Action has done is come in to fill the gap and say, who is doing the everyday ongoing work to connect with and move more white women to join this durable multiracial majority? And that's really where we come in. The good news is that where we have worked, we've seen a ton of progress. So you will know that in 2020, after watching 4 years of President Trump, the sort of sad news is that more white women nationally went for Trump than did so in 2016. So even after 4 years of watching the racism, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the misogyny, we saw more white women go towards Trump, but not where Galvanize worked. Where we worked, we were able to significantly shift that trend and move more white women, including significantly, you look in Wisconsin, white women without a college degree, towards Biden, right? And I want to talk to you, and this is where the hope comes in. How are we able to reverse that trend and make such significant progress with our partners in those states? And the answer is because we have done an incredible amount of research to really understand where the opportunity is and to understand who the voters are and to connect with them. We've actually found, after years of research, we found 13 million women living in these battleground states who are not particularly committed to either party. And in fact, if you ask them, they don't really love either one. And they live in rural, small town and suburban America. And they are, if you ask them how they feel about any of these issues, social safety net, should everyone get health care? Are they pro-choice enough? Do they want to see improvements in climate? Do they believe in common sense gun laws? They will say yes to all of those things, but they don't necessarily reliably vote that way. So our work was to figure out, if you believe that, what's holding you back from actually using your civic power to stand up, vote for progress, and also defend this democracy. The research we did led us to create a home for them. And I want you to think of Galvanize USA as kind of the Noom of civic empowerment. So if you know anyone who's done Noom, it's a behavioral psychology-based solution. So if women want, or folks want to lose weight, we know that it's not just a matter of saying like, I want to lose weight. You have to think about, how does your brain work? How does behavioral change work? And the Noom has been incredibly successful at working with the way the brain works and with the way behavioral psych works to get folks to have the results they want. We're doing a similar thing in the sphere of civic empowerment. And that's because we're able to look at, through a couple of years of research, like just sitting and talking with women to understand what's holding you back, what's going on for you. And we heard it from in first person from them, what was holding them back. Then we layered that on with the number of surveys, some focus groups, other research to figure out what can we build that would support these folks. And so what we did was created this online digital community where in the first year, 100,000 women joined us in that program. And this year we're doubling the size of that program. The community is designed first and foremost to help women make sense of the world together. So 74% of the women told us that they hate politics because where they live, and remember, they lean a little bit more liberal than the folks around them, they're living in red states and purple communities. Where they live, they think that politics will just lead to conflict. And so they want to avoid it. And then they don't have the opportunity to talk with other folks, especially folks who share their point of view about what just happened, how do I make sense of it? So the most important thing we're offering at Galvanize USA is a really supportive community within which you can have real conversations, figure out the world, but you won't be engaged in any us versus them, any conflict. The second thing is, and this is very much rooted in behavioral psych, we created opportunities to practice, the opportunity to build political knowledge and confidence. So that looks like challenges that folks can take to take brave actions, to have a conversation with someone they disagree with. It looks like tools to be able to identify what is a legitimate news source and what is feeding me disinformation. Quizzes to have, quizzes are a way that you get to incorporate knowledge and it helps you solidify it. So we offer quizzes and polls to get folks thinking about how do they feel about a topic and what's the truth. And then lots of tools to help them navigate civic empowerment. So where do you vote? How do you check to see if your vote was counted? Where could you volunteer as a poll worker? And ultimately the goal is through Galvanize USA to get all of these women in their communities, not only voting for their vision of an America that works better for everybody, but also standing up against what we see as this coming future insurrection. So how will they be willing to take brave action to make sure that they are defending against the sabotage of our elections in 24 and beyond? So that's Galvanize USA, but we're not the only ones talking to these folks, right? They're in, there's a reason that we're going after them. It's because they are open-minded, they're somewhat persuadable, they haven't quite made up their mind yet. So they're the target audience that not only do we want to be talking to, but so does the right. And what we're watching and have been watching for the last several years is extremists using these grievance-based narratives to try to drag these voters to the right. And so that's where you're seeing the culture wars, the grievance-based politics, the us versus them, all of these things that are intentionally designed to trigger fear and to spike resentment and try to get these voters who could go either way to go to a more extreme version of themselves. So not only are we working with women and trying to get them to think about what do they think and how do they want to vote, we're also connecting with them on the issues that they say they care about most, which is kitchen table issues. That's healthcare, economy, COVID. But we're also tracking what are these right-wing narratives that are being targeted to them. What are they seeing and what are they believing? And this chart shows you, this is a study we did last summer with women in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. And it shows you which of the false narratives are moderate women seeing and believing. And you can tell the border crisis was #1 here, with 90% finding it somewhat believable, 70% very believable. And that the border crisis is being tied very much to Vice President Harris. So you see her numbers here with 67% of moderate white women finding her to be unqualified, right? Because she's been tied to that border crisis. You also see concerns about socialism. You see issues about transgender issues, culture wars, right? Critical race theory. So when we go through and look at what are the wedges that women are seeing and believing, we can also identify who is believing which ones. So the border crisis is something that really is working with disproportionately with women living in rural America, whereas down below here, you see cancel, woke culture, white privilege, critical race theory, resonating more with suburban white women. And so they are disproportionately aware of those narratives and engaged in them. And what we know about dis and misinformation is the more that folks see that disinformation, the more they tend to believe it. For us, because we'd done that research at Galvanize Action, we were not at all surprised to see what happened in Virginia, right? The studies had showed us this would be what would be used to try to drag folks to the right. So up until the last few weeks of that race, most of the conversation was about economy, inflation, making ends meet, and healthcare. But in the last few weeks, Youngkin landed on a parents' rights frame in which he was using critical race theory, transgender kids in schools, and masks in schools, all as a form of grievance-based politics to try to drag folks to the right. And what we saw was that worked across the board for voters in Virginia, and it moved white women 15 percentage points towards Youngkin. So that was distressing, I think, to a lot of folks. For Galvanize Action, we saw that coming. And in fact, earlier last spring, we'd already been in Wisconsin doing deep canvassing calls with voters in Wisconsin about critical race theory, because our approach is not only to study it in the lab and understand what the data shows, but to get on the phone with folks, listen to them, hear how they're talking about it, what does it bring up for them, what emotions, what metaphors, so that we can do a good job of connecting with them. And after we figured out which narratives were going to be a big issue in 2022, we then went and did surveys on every single issue. So we had surveys on climate, on choice, on critical race theory, on COVID, on inflation, on socialism, on immigration. We looked at all those wedges. We did research on each one, and then we went into the lab and we figured out which women are movable on which issues. So on critical race theory, who is open to being moved on that issue? So we identify the women, then we figure out what's true about those women. We work with an amazing firm called Grow Progress, who has identified the values and traits of all voters nationwide, including yours. And so I'm able to see, these are the folks who are movable on critical race theory. What's true about them? What are their values and traits? So we use that psychographic data then to design messages that meet them at those values and that avoid the ways that we know the brain works to try to defend against new or contradictory information. We use neuroscience neuro hacks to go around the brain's defenses and to be able to connect with folks on their values. And last quarter, we were able to develop over 100 messages that significantly moved moderate white women across every single one of those issues. And so that's how we ended last year. And it brought us to this place into 22, where we're now working with creative firms to develop memes and GIFs and digital ads on each of those issues that we can push out into the field in advance of the midterms. And we have the opportunity both to meet people on the issues they do care most about, healthcare, economy, COVID, and inoculate against all of these race baiting, grievance-based politics that threaten to move this population to the right. And so that's where we're poised now, working with this amazing creative teams to develop all of those pieces of programming that we can send out to voters and that our allies can send out.
Great. Thanks so much, Jackie. This is all so interesting. I think what blows me away is that over 159 million people voted in 2020. It was the largest voter turnout in history, yet 2020 was closer than 2016. And Jackie is so laser focused on who it is that has the power, the white female women in these rural and small town communities. So it's just fascinating where you're focusing. So we've had some questions that have come into the chat, Jackie, that I wanted to have you address. First being, where does this misinformation come from? Are they getting from social media, TV? Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah. It speaks to both who our audience is, where they get the news and information, and then sort of what's going on for all of us in this internet age. So our population gets most of their news on Facebook and on local news. The men around them tend to be listening to Fox News or to conservative radio. And that might be true at work or in their truck or at home. And so what they have is both their own sources of information, Facebook and local news, and then what they're hearing from loved ones around them, which tends to be filtered through the Fox News perspective. Because we're all being inundated with information on the internet, it's increasingly hard to know what is true and what is not true. And so we are all tending towards turning to folks around us to do, it's called social proof. We check with folks around us to see, what do you think? Is this true? Is this not true? What, do you believe it? And so for these women, part of the challenge we have is the folks around them tend to be more conservative and having the misinformation sent to them. So that's a real part of the reason why we're creating an in-group for them that protects against that disinformation and builds up the ability to sort of make sense of things for themselves.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. And another question is, how many touch points does it take to inspire a woman to vote in a way that will actually benefit her and her family? And as someone who volunteers for Galvanize, maybe you can frame it in terms of the layered approach that Galvanize uses to reach the women and then persuade the voters, and how there's the long-term engagement also over the long term. Talk to that.
Yeah, I would say, so think about them as two different buckets. In Galvanize USA, that is the everyday long-term build community, connect with folks. It is explicitly nonpartisan. So there we're really saying we're creating an environment in which social workers and therapists and volunteers who are trained in values-based engagement can talk with women about, what do you want for your children? How, like, really it's a values-based conversation where women are thinking about, and grandchildren, thinking about, what do they want for America? What do they want for their community? And parsing through, well, how do I make sense of this offer or this candidate? And really that's about supporting them and validating their existing point of view, and then helping them to identify and dispel the disinformation. So that's a long-term transformational approach. Galvanize Action is where we're saying, we're looking in particular states and we're saying, how many folks will we need to move on this issue to win? And there we're saying, now who can we move on this issue? And then what is the way to connect with them on their values, with a message that's going to work, using a messenger they respond to. And then what does science tell us about how many times they would have to see that message to feel persuaded by it? And so at a minimum, we target each individual with 3 messages, the same ad 3 times. But this gets into how expensive ads are and how we get them to the folks, right? So the cool thing about the evolution of data science is once we identify who is movable, we can go, in the lab, in the survey, we can say this kind of person is movable on this issue. Then we have the ability to model and actually go down directly to the actual voter file and say, this person living on this street in Michigan we should hit her with this ad. She will respond well to it. So how do we make sure we get that ad to her? We know what shows she likes to watch. So a lot of our women like shows like Outlander. So, and they also really like Dolly Parton. So I appreciated hearing Dolly at the outside of this show. So we can say, let's go if they're watching Outlander, how do we make sure that we're the ad that they see before Outlander starts? So you think about how when you're watching on your tablet or your phone, and there's that annoying ad you can't skip, that's Galvanize action. But it's an ad that's designed for you to connect with what's going to move you the most.
Great. Just 2 more questions, and then we'll move on and we'll go back to some of the other questions that have come in. So one question that came in is, what sources of information do you use as you educate these women on the different issues? And are the women ever suspicious of some of the sources?
Yeah, and so in Galvanize USA, that it's the intention there is to make sure it is a genuine civic empowerment program, right? So there we have sources where we can we put up in like a meme, and that it's pinned to the group, and they can see, they can look for themselves. What is the source you're listening to? How does it fall in a spectrum of objective, and how much of it is news versus opinion? And so they can see, oh, I'm listening to this thing, and it's a little bit to the left, or it's way to the left if you're on MSNBC, or it's a little bit to the right, or it's way to the right, right? So people can see for themselves what's the filter I'm looking at. And then in the groups, we only allow information that is in the center. So that is the most news and the least opinion, right? And the least filtered on either side. So we're able to say, like, this is the straight news. Now let's make sense of it together. And the important part there is to connect with folks on, if this is what's true, now how do you process that? How do you make sense of that information? And that's something that folks, if you're struggling in life and you just trying to make ends meet and get your kids to school in COVID, like, it is hard to create the space for that, especially when a lot of people around you, if you talk to them, what you're coming up against is a finger rattle explaining that you're wrong or conflict. So this creates a space to sort of think through that together with other women. And it's pretty heartwarming to see it happen. Women are constantly saying, they'll bring into the space, like, my husband says this, I'm not sure it's true. And then another woman will say, actually, it's definitely not true. I'm an 8th grade history teacher. Let me break it down for you. And then, or let me show you this link. And there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Peer education, which neuropsych tells us, like, peer education is actually some of the most effective. We trust our friends more than any other source.
Great. So let's pivot, and I know people always love the case studies. Can you give an example of how Galvanize actually meets women at their values?
Sure. So let me show you on critical race theory. Here's an example. What we do first is we ask questions on a survey and say, all right, how do you feel about critical race theory? You can see the kind of question we would ask on the right-hand side of the screen. And then we ask people how do they feel, and then we look at the folks who are movable, and then we find out what's true about them. So in this case, they're moderate partisanship, they're under 99K. Importantly, we look at their values, in-group care, emotionality, patriotism, authority, security, fear of chaos, and lack of security. They tend to be Catholic, like that's who is exceptionally movable in this, and they tend to live in suburban or rural areas and have some college education, but not a 4-year degree. So knowing that about them, there's some like demographic truths, but for us, the psychographic is the most important. So we look at their values, we look at their what motivates them, and then we do qualitative research with them as well, so we can understand how are they holding this, right? So this is a good example of what we heard a lot from women who were on the fence about critical race theory. They were taught to be colorblind, that the height of non-discrimination is colorblindness, and that if you talk about race, it's going to make it worse. And these are folks who are fairly conflict avoidant, right? And so they think, oh my God, don't put that in the schools, it's just going to make it worse. What we also saw was a lot of anxiety for their sons. And we saw this actually across issues. We saw this when the Supreme Court nominee happened with Kavanaugh. I can talk about that. We saw this on choice issues when the Texas abortion ban in Texas came up. We were able, the most effective way in was to talk about their sons, not their daughters. Here we heard women being afraid that their sons would feel bad, that they would feel shame about being a white man in America if they were taught about race in schools. And so it's not that they didn't want to talk, it's not that they are taking a position where they're racist or they're anti-equality. They think of themselves as both, as being pro-equity, right? But they're more concerned with in-group care, number one value, about their son feeling bad or shameful. So that is, if we understand that, now we can craft messages. So let me show you these two messages. I'm going to give you a minute to read it. These are two messages that we wrote. I'll give you a second, and then I'm going to invite you in the chat to guess which message did better. So you can just take a second to read it and then put number 1 or 2 in the chat.
Hey, Jackie, and you might just want to quickly read them aloud because not everybody's on.
Oh, sure.
Mind doing that quickly? Thanks.
Sure. My grandfather flew a B-2 bomber in World War II. His plane was shot down and his crew saved by the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-Black unit. Back then, units were still racially segregated. I grew up hearing my pop's story and believing that we're all equal and deserve respect. Stories like these are an important part of history. That's why I support schools teaching about race and discrimination in an honest, fair, and unbiased way. We need to learn from our past so we can continue making our country the best. I know my pop would want that. God bless his soul. That's number 1. And number 2, we use MLK. MLK Jr. told us to judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. As someone who believes that everyone is equal and deserves respect, I wouldn't judge anybody based on color. But that doesn't mean turning a blind eye to racism or discrimination. That means understanding the different challenges we all experience and that learning should happen for all of us. That's why I support schools talking about race and discrimination in an honest and unbiased way. Okay, so those are 2 messages we wrote. Let me give you 1 second, put either number 1 or number 2 in, and then I'll show you the results. Okay, here we go. All right, number 1 wins it. This is actually a true story of my grandfather, and we're about to make a commercial based on it. It moved moderate white women 32 percentage points in favor of critical race theory. This is bananas good. If we were to make this ad and put it out into the field, if you have a political ad, you're pretty happy with 2 percentage points in the field. Now, this is something we test in the lab, so we expect to lose about half when we get into the field. But even if we were able to move people by 16 percentage points, that would be out of the park good. So why did it work so well? Think about what we know about the folks, right? What the perspective they have of themselves in the world. The first thing I did was talk about my grandfather, in-group care, number 1 value. I brought them into my family and I connected with in-group care. I called him my pop, which also for my Irish American friends, lots of us have nanas and pops. So I was bringing them in, that's helping them see themselves in this story. I used patriotism because it was a military story, and nostalgia in the references here. Right, so and my grandfather believed it. So again, looking to elders, to authority, to respect. And if he believed that, then that's valid. And he was a military man. And then lastly, in the end, I put God bless his soul. Well, actually, my colleague added that little nugget. And she did that because she was triggering the Roman Catholic notion, right, that a lot of the Catholics were movable. So that's an example of how carefully we craft this to make something that works. And this is a little bit of a trick question on you because the MLK Jr. one worked very well as well, and for a lot of those same reasons. But the important thing is we're not meeting them at assuming they're wrong or bad or have the worst intentions. We're meeting them how they view themselves, addressing the challenges and inviting them with us. I'll quickly do immigration. Remember, the border crisis is the number 1 issue in terms of the right-wing narratives and grievance. And we see that a lot because, and especially among women in rural America, because they're so economically stressed and they're being told these folks are coming in to take your husband's job. That's the other thing. We're able to look at folks in terms of all kinds of things that are true about them, including racial resentment, include out-group derogation, how their internalized sexism. And so what we see here is that folks who are a little bit higher in internalized sexism are a little bit more dependent, at least mentally, on their husband's profession or job, and they're worried about that job in this time in America. And they're being told it's immigrants who are taking it, right? So knowing that about them, we start to think about how do we craft a message. One of the things that really popped for me when I was reading the qualitative data, like what they talked about when we asked them about immigration, I was struck by how many people were talking, they used the word clean over and over again. When we asked them, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make your community better? And they kept talking about clean parks, clean roads. And I thought, what is going on? And then we went back and looked, and sure enough, purity was over-indexed as a value they had. So what we did here in this message was we actually created a mini us versus them, because that is how the brain sorts people. We're very careful about how we do that. We don't really like to participate in us versus them because we know where that leads. But here we did take the reality of a concern they have with some neighbors, right, who won't take their trash cans in, who leave their yard a mess, who won't pick up the dog poop. And that's really upsetting them, right? We saw that in the data. But then we have these immigrant neighbors who work hard, go to church. These folks tend to be a little bit more religious, raise respectful kids, high in authority, right? So respect, and keep their yard clean. I'll take immigrant neighbors any day. And variations on this theme, very successful, right? Another one we had just like this was sort of like, I wasn't so sure when my neighbor moved in, but then this is how they were, and now I'd take them any day. And it's really, it's not being afraid to say, this is what you're worried about. Let's connect with you and move you. And I'll say that when we craft messages, we're super careful about unintended consequences. So one of the things we don't want to do is respectability politics, where you only like certain kinds of immigrants and not the others. So we really check for backlash and unintended consequences as we're meeting folks in this work. I'm a little worried about the time, so let me just very quickly do this one. This is another place where we are looking at, we were successful at getting folks to be for COVID and for the COVID mandates and masks wearing. We're trying to figure out what can we do about all these politicians who they themselves are taking the vaccine, but then they're standing up and saying, but I'm against mandates, right? And then especially when we were doing this last year, really concerned about how they were undermining President Biden's policies and making it very hard to keep workers and folks safe. So what we did here in this message, you'll see is, again, with the Delta variant raging, pediatric ICUs are filling up. So we're triggering them as moms and grandmas, where you know that number one is in-group care. They're most worried about their kids, right? And then we're looking at one of the main things that we see is they have a just worldview. They really don't like it when people don't follow the rules. And when you not following the rules hurts me, that's a trigger. So we see that the right uses that a lot. Here we're saying, look, if everyone who can, so you're avoiding the issue of, oh, but I can't. If anyone who can gets vaccinated and just follows the rules, essentially, we'll have a much better chance of keeping our kids safe. This is no time to play politics. The government needs to act now. And that's about keeping kids safe, right? This message did very well. And I just wanted to show you that it moved rural white women 26 percentage points, and it moved Republican white women 29 percentage points. So we're checking across demographics in addition to the psychographic modeling that we do. And here's just very quickly, you can see when we dissect messages, we're able to say, when we're crafting this, how are we doing so in a way that really does appropriately trigger a pro-social behavior, which is the opposite of what the right is doing, right? They're intentionally triggering grievance, racial resentment, and fear. And so we're trying to bring in hope and belief in each other. This is actually a good one for linked fate, right? If we all follow the rules and do this together, we can win. So that's an example of that. I thought you might want to see one of the ads that my PAC created last year. So my Galvanize action does all this research. We figure out all the data that helps us know what's going to work. We're creating the memes and the GIFs and the digital ads that are on these issues. And then we share them with everybody in the movement. So we have trainings, we're creating an interactive playbook. We want, if it's working, we want anyone who can use it to use it and get it out there. So we're working with a bunch of education groups now because our critical race theory messaging is so effective. They're just picking it up and taking it, using it in school board meetings, et cetera. So we try to share that as much as possible, but there's what Galvanize Action doesn't do is work on behalf of specific candidates. And I know the Big Tent doesn't do that either. So I have a separate organization, which is the PAC, which does do ads on behalf of candidates. What I wanted to show you right now is just an example. So for the lawyers out there, this is perfectly fine to do on this call because it's from 2020, which is in the past. I'm going to show you an example of an ad that we created using all of this psychographic information, but also there's a few neural hacks about how we intentionally create something that the brain will receive. So I'll show you that, but you know what I realized? I got so excited to talk to you, I forgot to share my sound. So let me come back here. Okay, see if this works. Let me know, Catherine, with a thumbs up if you can hear it.
I'm a substitute teacher and my husband works in a factory. We work really hard, but it's a struggle. What do I want in my leaders? I want somebody who gets it, who knows what it's like to worry about paying the bills each month. Don't just show up at a factory or a school for a photo op. Don't just BS me. Walk the walk and actually do something to help me. Actually have my back. That's what I want in my leaders.
Okay, so just quickly, and so some of the things you saw in that ad were the neuro hacks. This is an ad that was created using an iPhone. This is a real person in Pennsylvania. When she created this, you can see it's done in their real kitchen, right? So the first thing is episodic simulation. We want our audience to see themselves in this ad. The kitchen is a kitchen that if you're in this economic bracket, this looks like your kitchen. That looks like your microwave, right? I see myself there. When she looks down and she's showing you those hamburgers, that's a neuro trick so that you're actually you feel like you're the person looking down at the hamburger. So it puts you immediately into that kitchen. The hamburgers and hot dogs are things that you would have for dinner, if you're in this group. And I actually love that she's wearing that dress because I'm pretty sure I have that same dress from Target. Just the way she is and the way her family looks, it's so real. And what she's talking about is I want someone who sees me, right? And this is one of the biggest issues we see in terms of, do I feel seen? Do my candidates care about me? Am I part of this vision of America that's moving forward? Am I included in it? And so with this ad, we're saying, yes, this candidate sees you as you are. You see yourself in this ad, and so you'll be safe, right? The sense of security if you go with this candidate. So that's a way that we're able to craft it and use some of the neuro hacks that allow us to sidestep the brain's defensive that says this is just another political ad, it's not for me, I don't believe it. This is also kind of an example of social proof, which we talked about earlier. If someone who looks like you or a friend of yours, that's someone who you would find more believable.
So Jackie, a lot of people are talking about inflation. Considering this ad was from a while ago, but how are your target women being impacted by inflation, and how is Galvanize helping to move them on it through creative and messages and community?
Yeah, it is absolutely the biggest pain point. I have to say that it's really painful to be in community with folks and listen to them as they're struggling. So we hear so much like, I can't even fill up the gas tank to get to work. So it is really, really painful right now, and folks very aware of how much everything costs. Like there's no more bacon on the table because it's so extremely expensive. So just like I actually feel a little emotional just talking about it. Like to see how they're struggling right now. You can't fix that with a smiley commercial that's like, it'll be fine, right? Like that's not going to work. So part of what we do is say, like, how do you make sense of what's happening when you're being told that Biden is the reason for inflation, and that the right is giving you a different way out, who to blame, immigrants and Biden essentially, right, and socialism. And so what we need to do is find another way to connect with them and offer relief and hope. So part of it is find a way to make sense of it. So what's been successful is by identifying that that actually COVID is the problem, right? That COVID, the shutdowns related to COVID, the supply chain issues related to COVID, like that's the place to place the blame. Now, what can we do about it? So some parts of what we can do about it is if we all follow the rules and get back to work because we're being safe, everyone's vaxxed and safe. And then you can be, if you're going to be mad at someone, be mad at the people who won't get vaxxed, be mad at the politicians who won't have common sense rules to get us back to work and things back on track. So we're redirecting the frustration and the anger at the people that are subverting return to normalcy, or whatever the new normal is. And then we're also, what we're starting next is some commercials that'll be, and memes and gifts that'll be highlighting some of what has been done by the Biden administration in this last year through the infrastructure package. So, you know, there are, you know, we're working mostly in Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio, Pennsylvania, where literally bridges are falling down, right? We have an infrastructure package. How do we show what Joe is doing to try to rebuild our economy, to bring manufacturing? There's a new manufacturing plant coming into Ohio. We'll celebrate that. So how do you like make it concrete and make it real for folks who are genuinely hurting? That's it. Honestly, for us, that's been the hardest part. We're not trying to sell them something that's not true. We're trying to connect with them in what's really going on and help find the way through together.
And how do you tie the ad to a specific party to vote for?
I'm a substitute teacher, and my husband works in a factory.
Democrats really care because Republicans say they do, but they really don't. So how do you decipher that a little bit more for the target audience? I know it's very nuanced, but and then I'll let you get to this.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, it's really all about knowing the individual. It is not fact battling. And that is one of the things that we, as I think on the left, tend to really make mistakes about. You cannot counter disinformation or misinformation with facts. That's what we keep trying to do, but it doesn't work, right? What you're getting from the right is it's stuff that is carefully crafted to make you afraid, to trigger your fight or flight, to spike your racial resentment, right? You can't counter with that within the critical race theory saying, well, that's not true. Nobody teaches critical race theory. You know, finger waggle, that it doesn't work. So we might want to respond that way, but we can't. We have to respond with a hope and what we know about creating hope is, this is another neurohack. You only have hope when you find something believable that it could actually happen in the future. The way that you establish a belief in that is by a memory in the past. It can be an individual memory or a collective memory. And so we have another ad. If you want to go to Galvanize Action /research, you can see the 4 ads that were our blockbusters last year. We have another ad that's really rooted in examples of times in history. So again, recalling nostalgia, recalling patriotism. When in history have we done this thing successfully? And when we can remember that, we can think, oh yeah, we can do this again. And that's, you have to construct the ad in a way that evokes that for the person. So she thinks, oh yes, I believe you, right? That's a large part of why Obama was so successful. He was able to create a story, that a narrative that would bring us in emotionally and make us feel, make these folks feel like hope was rational, not just crazy optimism. And so that's what we're doing here. I know we're nearing time, and we're getting several questions as we go. I just want to make sure to, you know, you're going to wonder where we're at. So Galvanize Action is focused on, in the short term, right, this year, looking at these Senate races in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Those are 2 critical Senate races that if we don't win, the Dems will lose the Senate. Michigan will always be in, go blue, it's home. And then Ohio has a longer shot Senate race, but it is shaping up to be maybe the best example for us, the testing ground for 2024. If you've been watching the Ohio race, it's truly a race to the bottom in who can be the most like President Trump on the Republican side. And then the Democratic candidate is kind of Biden-esque, Tim Ryan. So we're there in Ohio, so we can both do our part to move the margins this year, but also very much learning about what's going to be needed for 24. Down in the bottom, you can see some of the other expansion states that we have the capacity to go in. We've done all the research and data analysis in these other battleground states, and we have the ability to tailor ads to work in those states. whether it's on the issue, so that might just be changing an accent. Last year we did one in Maine. We definitely needed to have a Maine accent because they know if you're from away. So in these states, we might just change the accent, or when my PAC takes this summer, my PAC will step in and start doing ads for candidates. And that's the place where my PAC would say, okay, well, who is, if there's a candidate in one of these places, let's tailor the ads that we know is going to work with this population for that candidate. So that's kind of where we're headed next. And I think I'll just, I do want to say, if you are supporting candidates, or if you're supporting groups who are doing any other part of the work in this movement, please make sure to tell them about what you heard here today and that this is available to them. We scale by sharing. We have a briefing coming up on the 24th for movement allies in the field, where we're sharing all of our research, all of the messages that worked. We're creating memes and GIFs with a comedy writer's room in LA, and we're creating the digital ads. We can share those so folks can circulate them among their own constituencies and use them in the races that they're interested in. So please make sure folks know about us, and that will get them into the interactive playbook where they can really learn, take everything we've done for our audience, but also all of the neuro hacks and neuroscience principles that we should all be using as we're crafting persuasion messaging. So please make sure folks know about us. And then lastly, of course, I need to tell you, this isn't free. It takes a lot to do this kind of data science and research and message testing. Everything we do is tested. We don't just throw spaghetti at the wall. Every single thing is tested in the field. We make sure it works. We're, even everything, right? So that layering of the research and the testing, and then the ad creation and deployment, it's a heavy lift. So in our C3, we're trying to raise about $3.3 million. In our C4, it's about 4.2. And so I really want to encourage you, if you're supporting other groups or other candidates, think of us as an investment for the field, because it really does redound to everyone's benefit.
Yeah, I thank you, Jackie. And I'll just add, as someone who was connected to Jackie through two different people who didn't even know one another, that, my husband and I have really pivoted our political support to organizations like Galvanize, because I kind of describe it as you get more bang for your buck. Jackie really, softens the ground for candidates, and it's a real compliment to supporting candidates because of the research-based nature of what they do and how they are able to connect with voters based on the values that resonate with them. The kitchen table issues, making ends meet, healthcare, things like that, and then inoculating women against the grievance-based culture that we know the right is working on, that drags voters to extremes. So, if you're so inclined, I just think what Jackie's work is doing is just so focused, where, the razor-thin margins, where these elections are now taking, that's where it's happening, is in these 3 states. At each election, it's been kind of frightening, and yet you get millions and millions of people who vote, but it boils down to these razor-thin margins. So, it's been great to get to know Jackie. Jackie, there's been some other questions that have come into the chat. If we have a couple minutes or two, that I just wanted to address. So there was a question about how some people want to vote and have a democracy, and others believe it is too overwhelming and just want to give their vote to an authoritarian. I know Kristen addressed it in the chat, but I thought it was interesting. Could Galvanize encourage that you use all, vote that won't go left but stay center? I mean, how do you speak to these issues where people are confused about the democracy and authoritarianism?
Well, it's true that a lot of the folks who we connect with do feel they're struggling with the conflict, right? That's kind of the big thing, that it's easier for them to pull back from the conflict that they're faced with in their daily lives, their husbands, their father-in-laws, their pastors, and that's what they're retreating from. And there, a lot of folks, as we talked about, are struggling, and it is hard to make it through. But my experience is most of the folks that we work with are actually voters, so they are exercising their vote, right? And the question is, how do they make sense of who they're voting for. And a lot of them, because they're retreating, end up deferring to folks around them who talk with confidence about who they say is the right candidate. This is a very rational thing to do. I just want to say, a lot of us do this in all parts of our life, right? Like, it is rational if you don't think you know enough about something to look to someone around you who you trust, who's telling you they know, and then say, well, I trust them, they seem to know, I'll go along with them. I do that with my husband about cars all the time. So this is happening for these women around politics. So part of the solution there is to say, you're already voting and you already value these things. You already see yourself as someone who believes in an America that works for everyone. Let us be your in-group. Let us be your community to work through this together, to validate those instincts, to be a community of women around you who says, let's think it through together. Is that really going to be better? Will not talking about critical race be better for our kids? You know, and then so that's what the C3 community does. And then a lot of it is countering. Authoritarianism uses us versus them and fear, right? That's the two tricks of authoritarianism. What we do is say, actually, we're connected, we're an in-group, we're a community together, and there is hope. And we establish hope through their own experience, through their own sense of self, and through, as we talked about, like memories of times we've done it before. So it's very carefully crafted to say, this is possible, we can do this together, and then and move folks on the particular issues in the way that's going to work best for them, with the messenger that's going to work best for them. And I can't underscore enough, please stop fact battling with people, and don't approach people assuming the worst of them. Like, connect with people at their values, using emotion, using what science tells us is the most effective way to do the art of science of persuasion. And you're just inviting them into who they think of themselves as and who they want to be. And that is the America that is going to survive and thrive, and where our democracy can become robust enough that we can make sure that we advance progress for everybody, right? And that's, I think, the end of the story, which is, these are folks who want the same thing we want. They're being told a very different story about what's happening in the world, and it's increasingly hard to parse it through. What we're offering is a community within which to make sense of it, and very carefully crafted ads that will target them when they need it in that moment, where they are watching Outlander, to say, let's move this way, shall we? And you know, the cool thing is that it's proven to work, right? We're not just guessing, and we're not wishing, you know, we are testing and proving and making sure that if you see our ad and you see their ad, our ad is going to move you, and it will work against that. And that, to me, is the beauty of the combination of having a human-centered approach that's backed by research and science and data. That was a really long answer, sorry.
No, it was great. I am a fact battler, so I really appreciate knowing that just, it's a waste of time. So I'm going to stop. I'm sorry, you know, Jackie, we could keep talking to you for hours, I'm sure. And I really appreciate that so many people put questions in the chat. I know we didn't get to them all. So I do want to remind you, if you want to connect with Galvanize, of course, go to the websites. Jillian Laux will take your email, so you can email her. It's in the chat. So please go ahead and do that if you want to learn more and find out more about the important work of Galvanize and Jackie. I think you've all heard and seen that she has the data, she has the research, and she's building the communities that we really need to be built for these voters who we really need to connect with. And they're Americans just like us. They love our country, and we just need them to be engaged in the political process in truth and facts. So with that, I want to wrap it up. I want to thank Catherine for moderating again so beautifully and wonderfully, Jackie and her team for coming to Big Tent USA. I hope everyone will come to Alexander Vindman tomorrow night to our Democracy Forum on the 1st, and Me Vecino on April 4th, I think. I'm so sorry I repeated myself twice. That is the problem with Zoom. I hope everyone stays safe and well. Welcome back to Big Tent USA 2022. We're going to do this together. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.